Hello and welcome to this A-Level exam technique tutorial. This video will remind you how to approach the short essay on the Unit 2 Russia paper. That's the 10-mark question. First, let's look at some broad principles which will guide us on how to approach the question. Now, the short questions are always phrased in the same way. You'll be given two factors or features, let's call them X and Y, and you'll be asked to evaluate which one was the most important or impactful. A top-level answer requires four main features. First, we need a consistent line of argument. This means we need a clear decision from the start about which factor is more important, and we'll return to that decision throughout the answer. One of the main features which marks a top-level answer out is the use of detailed and precise knowledge to support the analysis and the evaluation that we do. Both factors must be analysed and evaluated. This is crucial because if we only do one of the two factors, we end up in the lowest level of the mark scheme. The judgments we make about which factor was most important must be based on appropriate criteria. Now, this is not something to agonise over. At its simplest, it means we need to have reasons for our judgments, and these need to be made explicit in our answer. To tackle this question, you should allow 15 minutes. There won't be time to make a plan, but before writing, you should decide which of the two factors was the most important and be clear about the criteria for your decision. When you write, follow a three-paragraph structure. Analyse and evaluate the importance of each factor in a paragraph of its own, before writing a conclusion where you compare the importance of both factors. Now, if we look at previous exam papers, we can see that there are a few different types of short essay questions. Many of them ask you to decide which cause is more important for making an event happen. Occasionally, they require you to decide which was the most important result of something. There have been a few which require you to evaluate which of two problems or threats was greatest. At other times, you're asked to evaluate the success of two groups or factors. Now, because these questions come in different forms, reading the question carefully and identifying what you're being asked to judge is essential. There is no expected correct answer. You can prefer either of the factors. But your decision has to be based on criteria, and these depend on what you've been asked to evaluate. You'll need to think about that for a moment before you write the answer. Here are some ideas for criteria which might be useful. If you're evaluating causes, you might judge this by thinking about the role played by the cause. In other words, was it the underlying or root cause of the event, or was it just a trigger? Causes, changes, and consequences can all be measured by duration. In other words, how long they lasted for. We can also consider the size of the impact. Now, this could include both the number of people affected, but also how severely they were affected. You might also consider whether the impact was felt across different areas. For example, some events have both a social and a political effect. If the question is about evaluating success, then it makes sense to measure that by considering whether it achieved the intended aims. Finally, consider whether there are links between the two factors. Now, this is particularly useful for evaluating causes. we can consider whether one cause was enabled by or dependent on the other. Be flexible about which criteria you use. You don't have to use all of them. Whichever ones you use, they really have to be appropriate for the question that you're answering. Let's look next at a worked example. This one is about causes, as we're being asked to evaluate 2 reasons why the Bolshevik regime survived. Note, we've also got a time frame here, as the question says under Lenin, which suggests that our cut-off point is 1924, when Lenin died. Our first paragraph will be about the Constituent Assembly. Our second will be about Trotsky and the Red Army. And we'll follow that with a third concluding paragraph. We open the paragraph with a line of argument. Here we state very clearly which factor we are going to focus on in this paragraph, whether it was the most important factor and our main reason why. In this case, I've decided that the dissolution of the assembly was not the most important of the 2 factors. Next, we're going to analyse the importance of this factor. This means using our detailed knowledge to explain why it mattered for the maintenance of the Bolshevik regime. Now, there is plenty more that I could have said about the dissolution of the assembly, but this is the short essay question. The exam board understands that in 15 minutes you cannot analyse every aspect of the factor, so they recommend that you explain and develop 2 points about its importance, just as I've done here. Now, my line of argument is that this was not the most important of the 2 factors, so I'm also going to make a counterpoint. This means I'm going to explain at least one limitation of the importance of this factor. Using the phrase "despite this" is a good way of starting this part of the answer. The paragraph finishes with a judgment about how important the factor was. Note here that the criteria used to make this judgment has been made clear. It's based on duration. This factor was only important in the short term. Now, to give you an idea of how much you need to write here, we would expect your paragraph to be around 150 to 200 words long. Any more than that and you're going to run out of time on this question. Our second paragraph will follow a similar approach for the other factor. We begin again with our line of argument. In this case, I'm going to argue that Trotsky was more important. Now, this is entirely consistent with the previous paragraph. Once again, we analyse the factor by using our knowledge to make and develop 2 points. Here's the first one. Notice I'm using that phrase "this mattered" again here. Another tip here is to really focus on putting events into context. Ask yourself, why did this matter at that time? My analysis is continued with a further point. Because this was my preferred factor, I'm not going to develop a major counterpoint. I have accepted that Trotsky's measures were not popular, but I've also rebutted that quickly with a winning point. My paragraph ends with a judgment. Once again, note that this is based on criteria. Firstly, this factor had an impact on more than one aspect, both economic and military. And second, it had long-term importance. The final paragraph is a little different. Here we need to compare the importance of the 2 factors. We start with an overall judgment. Again, this has to be consistent with everything we've written so far, so don't change your mind about which factor is more important. We start our comparison of the two factors by presenting the strongest counterpoints against our decision. And we then provide our rebuttal. This means we point out the limitations of those counterpoints, saying why they are not convincing. We also provide our winning points for our decision. Notice all the way through this paragraph, my criteria are clear. As part of your preparation for the exam, you should practice this technique under timed conditions. Here you can see a selection of short essay questions that you could use to do this. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, don't forget to like it and subscribe to the channel where there are lots more A-level history tutorials.